there, I'm Evan and I'm a sales engineer at Retool. Today I'm going to walk you through building a dashboard in Retool to trigger AWS Lambda jobs. Lambda is a fantastic serverless compute service offered by Amazon, which makes it really easy to write code in several different languages. Today we'll be looking at a Lambda function that's written in Node.js. That code will run on Amazon serverless infrastructure to do whatever you want. So really great for backend processing of data. In this case, we'll be looking at setting up and triggering ETL jobs that are running in Lambda. So before we look at how we build this in Retool, I want to show you briefly what the Lambda function we'll be working with does. So here's my Lambda function. Again, this is for an ETL job. And so what we're doing here is defining a function to insert metrics records into a Postgres database. So that's what this function does. We are also going to be parsing data from G-Sheets. So we're going to have event data that's in a Google Sheet. We'll parse that data and then do a loop to aggregate metrics based on that. That's what this code does. And then finally, we'll bring it all together in this handler, which is going to execute the various functions to get the data from G-Sheets and then insert it into Postgres. So that's what this function does. And what that means is we're going to want to get our Retool dashboard to do a couple of things. First, we're going to want it to select an event sheet. So the idea here is you've got a non-technical user, maybe somebody who's not going to be executing this Lambda function directly in the Amazon console. You want them to be able to pick a Google Sheet from a list, confirm that sheet, and then upload the data into Lambda and get a confirmation message when it's inserted into Postgres. So we've got this stepped container set up and ready to go. This UI isn't doing anything yet, so our goal is to wire up these components and get these queries working. And you can see that I've already made a connection to my Lambda environment. Retool has an out-of-the-box Lambda connector. If you look at the configuration for this connector, you'll see it's very straightforward. You'll provide the AWS region, an access key, and a secret ID, and that's all you need to do to connect to Lambda and get access to trigger functions that have been built there. So let's talk through also how we're going to get this data from G-Sheets, because the Lambda function can only run once we've got the ID of the Google Sheet that we want to insert data from. So you'll see that we also have a connector to G-Sheets. I'm not going to show how that works since this video is really about Lambda, but suffice it to say, we can auth with Google and then we'll get access to read information from that service. So you'll see that the G-Sheets resource query lets us choose an action. And the action that we want is not to read data, but instead to get information about all of the available spreadsheets. So this is a very simple action. There's really nothing we have to do to provide additional parameters here. Let's go ahead and run this and see what it looks like. So you'll see that we get this data back, and we can pass the information from get sheets directly into our sheet select mapper. So this is our select component. We'll go to the map, and then we'll choose our get sheets query. And you'll see that the mapper automatically updates this information. Now, one thing that's not great about the way that this list available spreadsheets API works is that it doesn't alphabetize the sheets for us. So we're going to want to use some JavaScript to do that, and we'll implement a sort function here. One of the easiest ways to transform data that you get back from an API is to use the query level transformer. So this is going to be a JavaScript transform that only runs on the results of this query. And I'm just going to copy in a sort function that I've written here. What this is going to do is go through each of the elements in the array of results and sort them based on their name and then return the sorted array. So now if we were to run this, we will see that the results are now sorted alphabetically, and that makes it a lot easier for users to select them from the dropdown. There we go. All right, so we've got our Google Sheets implemented here, and the idea is that a user needs to select a sheet. In this case, I'm going to use my event data here. They're going to need to select a sheet and then click confirm to move to the next step. So to make sure that users don't skip this step, let's implement some logic that will disable this next button in the case that the event data is not selected. So what we'll do is use the disabled field here, and if an expression in this field evaluates to true, then the button will be disabled. You can see here it's not clickable. So we're going to write an expression based on the data that's available in the sheet select component. So if we take a look at the Retool State Manager, we'll be able to figure out how that works. So if we look at our sheet select component, we'll see that it currently has a value. That's the ID of the sheet that's selected. That's my event data sheet. If I were to remove a selection, you'll see that the value is null. So what that means is we can now disable the next button in the case that the value in sheet select is null. So we'll say disabled if sheet select.value, and then we'll negate that. So this should return false if sheet select.value is null, and then negating it means that this expression evaluates to true, which disables the button. So now if I were to select the event data again, we'll see that this confirm button allows us to go to the next step. So next, we want to display confirmation for the user. So you can see that this text here, it says trigger ETL Lambda with. We want to actually provide the name of the sheet that was selected so the user can confirm this is what they want to do. So we'll be able to get that information from our select component. So we can see again, the value is the ID of the sheet, but we want the name of the sheet to confirm for the user. So if we look at the available properties on this object, we'll see there's a selected item object, and it has both the ID and the name of the selected sheet. So we're going to reference the selected item.name in this label. So to do that, we're going to do sheet select dot selected item dot name. And so we can see that our event data sheet name is brought in here. And just to make this a little bit clearer, we'll say we'll put this in quotes, sheet. There we go. All right, at this point, we're now ready to kick off our Lambda function. We want to trigger that based on this button click. But let's fill out the Lambda query first to get this working. So here is our Lambda resource query. In this case, we're going to pick a function, and the function we'll use is my ETL workflow. And then we can specify a payload that's going to be sent along with the webhook that triggers this workflow. The payload that I want to pass through just contains a single key, which is the sheet ID. This is the ID that was selected by the user. So to get access to that, we'll do double curly braces, and we'll go to our sheet select.value. Again, that's the ID of the sheet that we need to pass through. That's all the ETL workflow needs to know in order to kick off the job to import that data. Now we're going to set up this confirm button to actually run this Lambda query when we click confirm. But the issue here is that we only want this to run the query if we're currently on the second step of the process. Because as you recall, when we click confirm here, this just moves us to the next step in the multi-step container. It doesn't actually run the Lambda workflow because we want this confirmation step. So we're going to modify the event handler on the confirm button because currently what it does, when we click it, it shows the next step. We'll add an event handler that says on click, we're going to control a query and trigger our Lambda function, but we're only going to run it if we're on the correct step of this multi-step container. So this condition, if it evaluates to true, will allow the query to run. If it evaluates to false, then it'll be a no-op when we click on the button. So what we'll do is examine the state of the container to understand how this works. So you can see the stepped container has a current view index, which corresponds with the current view. So if we're on index 1, that means that this query should fire, and if we're on any other index, it should not. So we can go back to our event handler to trigger the Lambda, and we'll look at the stepped container dot current view index. If the current view index is equal to 1, then we should allow the query to run. Otherwise, clicking this button will not run the trigger Lambda query. Also, we want to avoid moving to the next step in this process until the Lambda has finished running. So to do that, we want to make sure that we modify the event handler, which is set up by default to show the next visible view in the stepped container on click. We're only going to run this if, again, the stepped container dot current view index is not equal to 1. So now, because we're on view 1, this won't advance us to the next view when we click the button. And finally, to get us to advance once the Lambda function is finished running, we're going to add a success handler on the Lambda function. So on success of the Lambda query, we're going to control a component. The component we'll control is the stepped container. and the method that we'll call is to show the next view. So that's how we're going to make this navigation work. All right, so let's test it out and see if it works. So we're going to click on the confirm button. That's going to run our Lambda function. We should get a response back indicating if it was successful. So we'll take a look at the debugger, and the trigger Lambda data key is going to show us that there was a successful execution, and the payload contains information about the number of records that were inserted. Okay, so let's use this body information to customize the appearance of our success alert. So we want to be able to show the user how many rows were inserted into their database. And right now, that's got a placeholder. So we'll go ahead and replace this with some code. So again, looking at the structure of this data key, we know that we want to access the trigger lambda.data.payload.body. But what we really want to do is access the row count key from within that body. And this body, unfortunately, is stringified JSON. So that means we're going to have to parse it out before we can access that subkey. So we'll use the json.parse method for that. And then we'll be able to access the row count key. So now we're able to show the user that we inserted 330 rows. The last thing we need to do is figure out how to show the correct alert, because we want to show that the Lambda function failed to run if we get an error back from the Lambda API. So let's go ahead and try running our query one more time and see if we can get it to throw an error. All right, so if we look at the state manager, we will see that there actually was a function error. And the reason for that is because the client has already been connected. So we didn't close that client connection properly. What this means is that if there is a function error key in this data that comes back, then we know that there was an error, and we can display that error message here and show the correct alert. So what we'll do now is set up the hidden setting on the success message. We don't want to show this message if the trigger Lambda data includes a function error. So we'll say if there is a value for the function error, then this success alert should be hidden, shouldn't show at all. And if there is no value for the function error, so we'll say trigger lambda dot data dot function error, then we should hide the error message. And also we can access the error message to display that information in this alert. So let's do that in the description. So we'll go to trigger lambda dot data dot payload dot error message. So that information is now displayed to our end user properly. And the finishing touch for this app, because we want to make it reusable, is to have this confirm button take us back to the first step. So let's set that up now. We can see that our stepped container control has an option to loop back to the start of the container. That's checked, so clicking on this confirm button will take us back. But this text is a bit confusing. There's nothing to confirm. We're actually starting over here. So let's make our text conditional based on which view of the tabbed container we're in. So we'll say if our stepped container.currentViewIndex is equal to 2, which is the current view, then we should show the text start over. Otherwise, we should show the text confirm. So this construction we're using here is a ternary operator, and the way this works is first we list out a conditional. If this evaluates to true, then we will return the value after the question mark, and if it evaluates to false, we'll return the value after the colon. So this is basically a one-line if-else statement that we can write easily in Retool. So we can click on this button now to start over. The last thing I want to customize here is that when we click start over, this select event sheet is still showing the previous data. We probably should clear this out to get the app ready to go again. So we'll set up one more event handler on this confirm button click, which will reset this sheet select if we're going from the last step in the process. So our event handler will say when we click it, we're going to control a component. The component we're going to control is sheet select, and the method we're going to call is to clear the value. But we're only going to run it if we're currently on the last step in the stepped container. So we'll say the current view index is equal to 2. That's the only time we're going to run that part of the handler. So if we were to go back to trigger Lambda step, we click confirm, and then if we look back at our select sheet step, we'll notice that the event data is still selected, but if we were to go to view results and click start over, we'll see that it did reset the value of that sheet select. All right, so this has been, again, a quick tutorial on setting up a user interface for triggering Lambdas and passing in information. We also had a chance to explore some of the intricacies of using tab containers and the event handlers that might be conditionally running on top of them. I hope you found this helpful and looking forward to the next one.